Hello, you guys. Today we are going to be learning about the causes of World War II. So we'll talk about basically there's four main causes that lead to this war happening. Most of them connected to the resolution of World War I and kind of the outcomes from there. So these four main causes are kind of intertwined with each other. The first is the Treaty of Versailles. The second is the Great Depression. Both of those combined together to lead to the rise of fascism and authoritarianism in Germany, Italy, and Japan. Basically, those countries becoming much farther right on the political spectrum, much more militaristic, much more nationalistic, and much more inclined toward conquest and warfare, and kind of a desire to regain their status on the world stage. And then our fourth reason is the weakness of the League of Nations. So, you have these authoritarian regimes rising, and there's a lot of warning signs. And the League of Nations, which was supposed to keep peace after the war, really does nothing to ensure that happening. And so as a result of that, you have World War II. So let's take a closer look and see how all of this works. So our first cause is the Treaty of Versailles. You guys learned about the Treaty of Versailles yesterday. As you learned, most people were not happy with the outcomes of this treaty. Britain and France were pretty okay with it, but most other people were not. Italy and Japan both felt that they had not been given enough territory out of the treaty. They felt like they should have been awarded more for helping the Allies. The United States was not happy with the League of Nations, and Germany was, of course, coming off worst with the war guilt cause. So Germany was forced to accept all blame for the war. And it was also mandated that they were not allowed to unite with Austria. So after the war had ended, Austria-Hungary had collapsed. And many Germans thought that, and also Austrians, thought that, now that Austria doesn't have its own empire anymore, it would make the most sense for Germany and Austria to combine, because Austrians are Germans, culturally, ethnically, nationally. They speak German, they have German culture. And so now that the Austro-Hungarian Empire didn't exist, a lot of people wanted to sort of combine those countries together. However, it was decided at the Paris Peace Conference that would lead to Germany having too much power, and so Germany and Austria were kept separate. So a lot of Germans felt really bitter about this. They felt bitter about being blamed, and they especially felt bitter about the reparations that they were forced to pay. So Germany was forced to pay back the Allied countries for all of the damage that was done to them during the war, especially to France. However, Germany's economy also had suffered because of the war. German land and infrastructure had also been destroyed in the war. And so Germany was really, really struggling to pay back this debt they owed to Britain and France. The solution that they come up with to sort of fix that problem is to print more money. So, they print more money so that they can use that money to pay back Britain and France. However, as you probably have learned in your economics class, printing more money is not really a great idea, because what this leads to is hyperinflation. Just the way that goods work on a supply and demand basis, printed money also works on a supply and demand basis. So if there is more printed money, that means that that money is worth less. And so as a result of this, there is hyperinflation in Germany. In 1918, at the end of the war, a loaf of bread cost less than 1 German mark. In 1923, a loaf of bread cost 200 million German marks. And so what this meant is that, people who had been saving up their money for their entire lives, maybe they'd saved up, thousands of marks, that's now worth almost nothing. And so their life savings are now worthless. People have to take wheelbarrows to the market in order to pay for their groceries, wheelbarrows full of cash. We can see that in the bottom right photo. Money becomes so worthless that, it's easier to use it for other purposes than it is to use it to buy things. So on the top left, we can see people have kind of bundled stacks of cash into little blocks for children to play with. The woman on the top right is using money as kindling because that is cheaper than buying firewood. And the man on the bottom right is using money as wallpaper because that's cheaper than, buying actual wallpaper. So, the German economy is in the toilet. There is a brief glimmer of hope. The United States comes up with something called the Dawes Plan, wherein they offer to loan Germany $200 million. And by loaning them this money, Germany is able to have a stable currency that they can use to pay back Britain and France. And the US gets kind of the best deal out of this because that allows Britain and France owe the United States a ton of money. So they use the money that Germany pays them to pay back the United States. And Germany now has a debt to the United States that they're going to have to pay back eventually. So this works out pretty well and it starts to stabilize the German economy. But then the Great Depression hits. So in 1929, the US stock market crashes. This is really a result of overproduction of certain goods and irresponsible lending. So after World War I, in the Roaring 20s was really the first period of time where people could use credit to buy things in a widespread way. So people used credit to buy all sorts of things, household goods, houses, clothes, cars, lots and lots of things they were using credit to buy, which meant that they basically a bank or some sort of credit union actually buys the item, and the person who bought it has to promise to pay that back later. This is how credit cards work today. However, and that system can work okay as long as you're not lending irresponsibly. So people were buying things with credit that they really had no way to pay back. And banks weren't really paying attention to who they were lending money to and how much they were lending. And so people were ending up with massive amounts of debt that they really didn't have a way to pay back. This all comes to a head. It's basically there's like this big bubble that pops on October 29th of 1929 when the stock market crashes. Lots and lots of banks close. People lose their life savings. People lose their homes. And this is the start of the Great Depression. So by 1933, 25% of Americans were unemployed. And this, has huge effects in the United States. It also has effects worldwide because throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the world economy has become more and more global. So economic disaster in one country is going to affect places elsewhere. One huge effect of this is that the United States demand that any foreign loans be paid back as soon as possible. So, they were still owed quite a lot of money for supplying the Allies in World War I, and the Dawes Plan. So, they start demanding that the foreign countries pay them back. And that puts a lot of hardship on Britain and France, and especially Germany. As more and more countries fall into economic hardship, lots of countries start raising their import taxes, basically to try to protect domestic goods and sort of keep domestic industries going. They raise their taxes on foreign goods so that people will, buy domestically and keep domestic industries going. But this leads to foreign trade basically coming to a standstill. And pretty much every country in the world is hurt by the effects of the Great Depression. This sort of economic downturn becomes a huge opportunity for people to come in and say, we're going to fix these problems. For charismatic leaders to come in and say, the old regime was weak, and that's why we're having the problems that we have now. And we need to be strong, and strong leadership is what is going to fix this and bring the people out of this time of suffering. Lots of people were losing their faith in democratic government. They saw this as kind of like a failure of this experiment. And the response to this, in many cases, was to turn to fascism or to authoritarianism. So fascism has kind of a couple of basic principles. One is authoritarianism. There's usually a strong government that, is capable of telling its citizens what to do, and the citizens are not expected to question that. The government is supposed to have authority over pretty much every aspect of citizens' lives. Hand in hand with that is the idea that the state is more important than the individual. The state is supreme. That individual citizens' purpose is to uphold the state, to follow the state's direction, and to sort of increase the glory of their nation. Usually, fascism and authoritarianism go hand in hand with a charismatic leader, somebody who can kind of whip the people up into a frenzy of support. And it's also very action-oriented. Fascists are promising their people that they are going to fix their problems, that they are going to make their country, bring their country back to the glory days, make them great, sort of fix all of the problems that are going on now and bring them back to this imagined state of when their country used to be strong. They're usually pretty traditional and conservative. Fascists were promising to revive the country, to punish those who are responsible for hard times, whether those are foreigners or some sort of group within the country who are viewed as outsiders, minorities, and also to restore order and to increase national pride. This was a message that was really attractive to people who felt frustrated and angry about the problems that were going on in the world. It's especially attractive in places where they feel like they're being downtrodden. So it's not a surprise that that becomes a really popular idea in Germany. So many people in Europe are feeling really downtrodden as a result of the outcomes of the treaty, as a result of economic problems following the war or from the Great Depression. And this gives an opportunity for fascist authoritarian governments to take control. The earliest fascist regime is in Italy. Mussolini seizes power in 1922, kind of capitalizing on Italians' resentment for the Treaty of Versailles and the ongoing struggles to recover from the war. But we're going to focus more in this lecture on Germany and Hitler's rise to power. Adolf Hitler is made German Chancellor in 1933. And at this point, he actually doesn't have majority support among Germans. He has a lot of support. he's one of the larger political parties, but he has not won the majority of Germans over to his side. So he is kind of made chancellor, kind of as a way to shut him up. The other sort of leading political parties are like, this guy, we'll make him chancellor. But the real power in the German democracy was with the Reichstag, with the legislature. And so they thought that, by giving Hitler this title, they could kind of sideline him. However, Hitler turns the table on them. He almost immediately calls for a vote to be made in the Reichstag to suspend the German Constitution, the Weimar Constitution, and to concentrate all power in the hands of the Chancellor. And Hitler then stacks the vote by blocking the doors to the Reichstag. He has his sort of paramilitary militia, the SA, block the doors to the Reichstag and not allow any opposition party members to enter the building and vote. And so only Nazi party members are allowed to vote in this decision. And so, of course, the chancellor is given supreme power, and the Reichstag basically votes itself out of existence. Following this, Hitler then, seizes control of the media and takes control of the narrative surrounding this. And in doing so, he's actually able to sort of win over more and more support from German people. After taking power, Hitler bans other political parties, and he also uses other political parties as scapegoats. So communists especially are targeted under Hitler's regime. Many of the first people to be sent to concentration camps are actually political rivals. So communists, people who were communist politicians or who wrote communist newspapers were attacked and murdered or sent to concentration camps. Hitler also works to sort of clean up his own party and eliminate any rivals that are existing within the Nazi party. So he creates the SS, which stands for Schutzstaffel, which was basically Hitler's own personal army. The SS arrested and murdered hundreds of Hitler's political enemies within the Nazi party. Is the one particular night where hundreds of people were killed was called the Night of Long Knives. Later on, the SS would become sort of the leading group putting into action the Holocaust. Hitler also creates the Gestapo, who are basically secret police. So basically he's spying on the German citizens, looking for signs of disloyalty. So ultimately the Gestapo would be reporting on people who are secretly communist, secretly gay, hiding Jews, and reporting them to the German government. He makes strikes illegal. Striking from work was seen as harming the nation. Industry is important for the strength of the German nation. And so if you are going on strike, then that means that you are harming the German nation. And of course, the nation, the state, is more important than the individual. And so therefore, strikes are illegal. He uses the press, radio, literature, paintings, film as his propaganda tools. So German people are living in this kind of bubble where all they're seeing is Nazi propaganda. He forces he basically forbids German churches from criticizing Nazis or the government. And anybody who is doing so is liable to be murdered or hauled away to a concentration camp. And he also forces German school children to join into Nazi organizations like the Hitler Youth, which are basically brainwashing them. So he immediately takes very forceful control of the country. However, he's also very popular because he is promising reforms. So although a lot of his control involved, force and authority, and he was a dictator, most German people really approved of Adolf Hitler and his actions because they saw him as sort of increasing German glory, regaining the honor, and the strength that Germany had lost in World War I. And so despite kind of the strict control that he had over the German population, he was still very popular with many, many Germans. And that popularity increased as he is able to silence dissenters and control the narrative that the German people are hearing. One huge element of German control of Nazi control is scapegoating. Hatred of Jews, anti-Semitism, was a key part of Nazi ideology. The Jews were used as scapegoats for all of Germany's problems. So there was this kind of myth within German society that, Jews were working against German greatness. Jews were taking all the good jobs. They were known for being kind of many German Jews were kind of in the professional sphere, so there were lots of Jewish doctors and lawyers and bankers and professors, and so they were seen as kind of hogging the good jobs. Jews were seen as outsiders, and Germany is all about nationalism at this point. The Nazis are all about nationalism and the greatness of Germans, and so having this kind of sizable group of outsiders within their country is, seen as harming this national strength. So Hitler had espoused this hatred for Jews long before he became chancellor. And after he becomes chancellor, he begins to put anti-Semitic laws into place that would further marginalize Jews and also encourage the rest of Germany to look at them as outsiders. One really important set of laws is the Nuremberg laws that are passed in 1935. These were a set of anti-Semitic laws. They did things like prohibit marriage between Jews and Germans, prohibit sexual relations between Germans and Jews, stop Jews from hiring German females as domestic servants. This was seen as kind of like it implies that Jews are dangerous to young German females. They're somehow going to corrupt them or harm them, and so they can't be allowed around German women. Any Jews who had not fought in World War I were then prohibited from teaching in universities. So many Jewish intellectuals lost their jobs. And eventually, that allowance of having fought in World War I was also removed. And so all Jewish intellectuals were expelled from university. And the punishment for violating these laws included hard labor or even imprisonment. So these laws and laws that follow after them start to sort of marginalize Jews, push them farther away from the mainstream German population, and make them more and more viewed as others. And it also starts to chip away at their economic viability. Intense taxes are put on Jewish businesses as well. The first time this really escalates into widespread violence is on October 9th of 1939, when there is a Jewish man assassinates a German official in Paris. And as a result of this, mobs of angry Germans, including members of the Nazi Party, attack thousands of Jewish-owned buildings and businesses, as well as anybody walking down the sidewalk that they believed was a Jew. Jewish synagogues were burned. Jewish Businesses were looted and vandalized. Many Jewish people were beaten up and left for dead on the sidewalk. This night is called Kristallnacht, which translates to the night of broken glass. At this point, many Jews are starting to realize that things are going south for them in Germany, and that things are escalating, and that they may not be safe anymore. And so many German Jews start trying to leave the country. But a lot of other countries are reluctant to accept them. Anti-Semitism is pretty widespread, and so it's not uncommon for countries to have quotas of how many Jews they are willing to take. As a result of this, what happens is a lot of Jewish men leave to go and sort of find work, get themselves situated, and then the idea is that they will send for their families later. That's a pretty common immigrant strategy throughout history, is like one family member will go and sort of get ready for everybody else to come. But what results happening from this is that the majority of the Jewish population that's left in Germany is women, children, and elderly people who would not be able to defend themselves at all. We'll return to this idea of anti-Semitism when we talk about the Holocaust, but I do want to highlight this idea that part of Nazi control over Germany is this scapegoating of Jews, and that a large part of their motivation in the war is the extermination of Jews. So that's Germany. Germany is becoming fascist. So is Italy. France. Japan is also becoming increasingly authoritarian. So they're not becoming fascist, but they are becoming authoritarian. So a lot more control over the population, a lot more focus on military strength, a lot more focus on nationalism, and this idea that, citizens' purpose is to serve the state and serve the glory of Japan, the glory of the emperor. We had talked about the Meiji Restoration and this return of a strong emperor to the throne, and the sort of beginnings of Japanese imperialism when we talked about our imperialism unit. This continues throughout the 1910s and Japan's participation in World War I. During the 1920s, Japanese government does become slightly more democratic and slightly more peace-oriented. This is kind of in the aftermath of World War I, there's a lot of actually prosperity in Japan. They're experiencing the Roaring 20 as well, and so they're kind of more peacefully minded. As an example of that, in 1922, Japan signs an international treaty agreeing to respect China's borders and not invade them. However, Japan's parliamentary system was pretty weak. So although the sort of parliament section of the government was gaining more power, there were strict limits on the powers of the prime minister and the cabinet. Civilian leaders, so the prime minister, still had very little control over the military. The military acted as kind of a separate entity, and military leaders really only reported to the emperor. So what this means is that the government in Japan has kind of two factions. There's the parliament, the civilian government, who are kind of legislating and creating laws and ruling, and then there's the military that are entirely separate from the authority of the parliament. And so these two parts of the government start kind of competing for power. And the sort of shift in power comes from the Great Depression. So the Great Depression happens, and many Japanese people blame the government for the hardships that they're feeling. And so military leaders use this as an opportunity to gain control of the country. And so, the emperor is still on top throughout all of this, but the military becomes a lot more powerful than the legislature. And that means that Japan's focus, once again, shifts much more towards military matters. Many of Japan's military leaders were extreme nationalists. And so they wanted to solve Japan's economic problems by foreign expansion. Basically, if they go and conquer more territory and gain more resources, they will be able to sort of drag themselves out of this economic depression. And also, producing the means of war, ammunition and weaponry, is also going to help stimulate the economy and drag Japan out of the economic depression. And so Japan becomes a lot more militaristic and a lot more imperialist once again. So we have these new regimes or new sort of ideologies coming to the fore in Germany and Japan and Italy. And a lot of the promises that those governments are making is that they are going to, heal their nation. They're going to bring back the nation's strength and pride and glory and make them great through military conquest. That they're going to sort of prove their superiority through military conquest, that they're going to regain lands that had been lost to them, regain lands that had been denied to them, and that they are going to sort of begin this age of conquest. And there is a provision in the Treaty of Versailles and the outcomes of the Paris Peace Conference that is supposed to stop this from happening, and that's the League of Nations. So the idea behind the League of Nations was that this would be an organization where countries around the world could solve their issues through diplomacy, so that you wouldn't have people expanding aggressively, so that you wouldn't have wars starting all over the place, that people would use their words instead of their guns. And the leaders of the League of Nations were supposed to sort of curb aggression from places like Japan and Germany and Italy. With these countries becoming more and more aggressive, people start turning to the League of Nations, and especially to Britain as sort of the leader, to sort of bring peace and to stop this trend from happening. But ultimately, the League of Nations proves to be completely ineffectual at this. One of the large reasons for this we can see here in the top on the side. The United States had been the one to come up with the idea. Woodrow Wilson had come up with the idea, but in the end, Congress refused to ratify the treaty and refused to join the League of Nations. So the U.S. was not part of it. And that was a huge stumbling block for it. And also, the League of Nations didn't really have a lot of power to do anything. So it could censure someone. It could say, hey, no, don't do that. But they didn't really have any power to back that decision up other than, declaring war, which is what they're trying not to do. So we can see this happening with our authoritarian nations. So first, looking at Japan in 1931, Japan invades Manchuria, so that region that's north of the Korean Peninsula, part of China. Japan invades there and conquers that area, and the League of Nations protests, and Japan's sort of response to that is to just withdraw from the League. They don't have to listen to them, and they don't even have to be part of it. In 1937, Japan declares full-scale war with China, and that's really the beginning of World War II. People talk about a lot about it beginning in 1938 or 1939 with the Nazis invading Poland, but Japan had already invaded China and begun the eastern half of the war in 1937. In 1935, Mussolini attacks Ethiopia. And again, the League of Nations is powerless to stop this. Hitler also makes actions that the League does not stop. So in 1935, Hitler starts rebuilding the German military. and remilitarizing the area of German territory near the French border. So both of these actions were specifically prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles. So the Treaty of Versailles said that Germany could only have a certain number of soldiers in their army, and that Germany could not station their troops along the French-German border, basically to stop them from being able to start another war. Hitler ignores this. He starts commissioning factories to build weapons and tanks and airplanes and all sorts of instruments of war. He starts employing men in the military. He starts moving people towards the French border. And there's a couple of things that go into this. One, he is trying to sort of position Germany towards war and position Germany into a position of strength. Saying, no, we're not going to be cowed by this treaty. We're not going to continue being punished by this treaty and blamed. We are going to sort of regain our German honor, regain our German pride and nationality. And that involves, building up their military strength. It also is motivated by, economics. If he's employing citizens in factories and employing citizens in the army, the economy is going to be stimulated. And so that's going to help Germany come out of the Depression, and it does. However, as I said, both of these actions are against the Treaty of Versailles, and the League of Nations condemns these actions but does nothing to stop them. And so Hitler just continues. The League of Nations is also ineffectual at intervening in the Spanish Civil War that happens from 1936 to 1939, wherein Franco is fighting to create a fascist government in Spain. And then again, in 1936, Germany, Italy, and Japan form an alliance as the Axis powers, which they're not really supposed to do under the direction of the League. And again, the League is powerless to do anything to stop them. Really, the only action that the leaders in France or Britain or the United States could have taken to stop Hitler or Mussolini or Hirohito in Japan from actually doing what they were doing would have been to declare war and to go to war. And there are people who argue that if they had declared war earlier, they could have stopped the war before it got so bad. But if they had declared war right when Hitler started remilitarizing, Germany wouldn't have had nearly the resources that they ended up with, and they wouldn't have had sort of the head start that they ended up with because the League of Nations did nothing. However, instead of starting a war, Britain and France were following a policy called appeasement. They really, really did not want to go to war. And so instead of taking a stand, they kept on making concessions. They kept on saying, oh, well, we'll just let Hitler do this, and then he'll be satisfied, and everything will be fine. And then he does something else. Oh, we'll let him do this, and then he'll be satisfied, and we won't go to war. They were also dealing with serious economic problems that were stopping them from wanting to go to war. There was, sort of the legacy of World War I that was stopping them from wanting to go to war. So they were willing to make a lot of concessions in order to keep the peace. The United States, meanwhile, had become intensely isolationist post-World War I. Many people in the United States felt that political ties with other countries should be avoided, that the United States shouldn't have gotten involved in World War I, that it should stay out of any future wars. And in 1935, they actually passed the Neutrality Act that bans loans and the sale of arms to nations in war. So part of what had kind of gotten the U.S. into World War I was that they were supplying the Allies with weaponry and that they were loaning the Allies money, and that was part of why Germans were attacking United States ships. And so the Neutrality Acts are supposed to avoid that. So the U.S. is just not willing to get involved in the problem, and Britain and France are hoping that if they just give these fascist leaders something, that they'll be satisfied and they won't try to take over the world. And what that ends up looking like is that Hitler and Mussolini and Hirohito are just walking all over these people and getting their way and positioning themselves into a position of strength where they'll be able to start this war and be really strong and really hard to defeat. So yeah, so that is the sort of strategy that the League, and especially that Britain, is going with. And so by 1938, it really, from an outside perspective, it really is obvious that Germany is not going to stop, that Germany is not going to be satisfied with any sort of appeasement that Britain can offer them. But Britain is still not acknowledging that. In 1938, Hitler annexes Austria. This action is called the Anschluss. And then he also intends to annex the Sudetenland, which is the western part of Czechoslovakia. So if you're looking at the map on the bottom here, you can see how Czechoslovakia kind of is surrounded on three sides by Germany for part of it. So Germany felt like that area had a lot of Germans living in it and that it should have been part of Germany. And so he intends to annex the Sudetenland. Interestingly, when Hitler annexes Austria, he is met with cheering crowds. That is what the picture at the top is of. So there is a sort of military parade of the Nazis parading through Austrian streets, and those are crowds of Austrian women cheering for the soldiers, so excited that they are there, because this was actually a pretty popular move among Austrians, because they considered themselves to be German by ethnicity, and so many Austrians were pretty happy to have become part of Germany, since they no longer have their Austrian Empire. If you've seen The Sound of Music, this sort of subplot features quite heavily. The Von Trapps are Austrian nationalists instead of German nationalists, and so there's the whole Nazi subplot in The Sound of Music where Austria gets annexed, and most people are pretty happy about it, but the Von Trapps are not, and that's why the Von Trapps have to climb every mountain and ford every stream. But anyway, so Hitler has annexed Austria. And Britain is, a lot of people are looking at Britain like, aren't you going to declare war on them for this? He was not allowed to do that based off of the Treaty of Versailles. He has just conquered an entire country. But Britain decides that, Austria seems fine with it. And they get Hitler to promise that Hitler will not take over the Sudetenland. That Hitler's going to be satisfied with this, and this is enough. 6 months later, Hitler takes over the Sudetenland. And he also demands that Poland hand over the territory that is sort of separating Germany from East Prussia. So part of the weird map drawing that happens in the Treaty of Versailles is you have Poland has the Polish corridor, which sort of cuts through German territory so that they can have access to the sea. But, it makes sense in that way, but it makes no sense because now Germany's cut in half. So Hitler is demanding that Poland give back that area. When Poland asks Britain and France for help, they refuse, and Poland ends up handing over that territory. In 1939, Hitler signs a non-aggression pact with Russia. In that pact, they agree that they are going to split Poland into, so Germany is going to get the western half of Poland, Russia is going to take over the eastern half of Poland, and they're not going to fight each other. And then they do that, and then Germany attacks Russia and takes over the rest of Poland. And at this point, Europe, Britain and France cannot ignore this aggression anymore. And so Europe is headed to war.